What happens when faith becomes a call to war? The year was 1095. Europe was a land of kingdoms, castles, and endless feudal struggles. Lords fought each other for land, peasants toiled under harsh taxes, and the church held the power to sway kings and commoners alike. Yet across the Mediterranean, a different storm was brewing. Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Christendom, was under Muslim control. Pilgrims were denied access to holy sites, and tales of suffering reached the ears of the faithful. In the city of Clermont, France, Pope Urban II stepped onto the wooden platform before a sea of nobles, knights, and commoners. His voice rang out with a mixture of authority and urgency. God wills it. Let those who are able take up arms to reclaim the Holy Land from the hands of the infidels. The crowd erupted in fervent cries, a tidal wave of devotion and ambition sweeping through the assembly. Men of all classes, knights with shining armor, peasants with little more than sticks and courage, pledged themselves to a cause larger than themselves. Families would be torn apart, villages abandoned, as entire armies prepared to march thousands of miles to the lands of the Levant. Across Europe, letters and messengers carried the Pope's call from village to castle. Young nobles sharpened their swords and painted crosses on their tunics, while merchants and craftsmen volunteered to march, hoping for fortune and glory. The journey would be perilous, filled with hunger, disease, and skirmishes even before the first true battle. Rivers and mountains loomed as natural barriers, but the zeal of faith burned brighter than any fear. Imagine a young knight, barely 20, standing at the edge of a crowded market square, the red cross stitched onto his surcoat, catching the morning sun. His mother weeps silently as she hands him a loaf of bread for the road, whispering prayers for his safe return. In the distance, the dusty path beckons, leading to lands unknown, filled with both promise and peril. As armies assembled in towns across France, Germany, and Italy, the sheer scale of the crusade became clear. Tens of thousands of men, horses, and wagons began the march across Europe, forming long lines that sneaked through forests, over mountains, and across rivers. Each step forward was filled with anticipation, fear, and the thrill of impending destiny. Yet not all were united in purpose. Some knights sought only personal gain, lands to conquer, wealth to claim, titles to earn. Others were driven by faith, genuinely seeking to reclaim the sacred city of Jerusalem. And in the chaos of this enormous mobilization, ordinary men and women were swept along, their lives forever altered by the tides of history. As the First Crusade began, Europe had set into motion a chain of events that would echo across centuries. The call to arms was not merely a summons to battle. It was a transformation of an entire continent, a collision of faith, politics, and human ambition. And from the rolling hills of France to the dusty plains of Anatolia, the march of the Crusaders would forever change the map of the medieval world. In the next chapter, we will follow these armies across Europe and into the Levant, witnessing the harrowing journey that led to the first great clash at Antioch and the legendary siege of Jerusalem.
Imagine walking thousands of miles with nothing but faith, a sword, and the promise of salvation. The Crusaders' march to the Holy Land was no ordinary journey. It was a pilgrimage that turned into a trial of fire. By the time they left Europe and entered Byzantine territory, the reality of the mission hit like a hammer. Men collapsed from hunger, horses died along the road. Villagers watched in shock as endless lines of weary crusaders passed through their lands, an army of believers, but also an army desperate to survive. Disease spread, tempers flared, and yet the red crosses on their tunics burned like symbols of destiny. When they finally reached the great city of Antioch in 1097, their task was clear: capture one of the strongest fortresses in the Middle East. Its walls were massive, its towers unyielding, and its defenders ruthless. For 8 grueling months, the Crusaders lay siege to Antioch. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and desperation drove some to unthinkable acts. "We fight for God's city, yet we starve like animals," a knight whispered as he clutched his sword, too weak to raise it. And yet, faith and strategy triumphed. In June 1098, through betrayal and bold assault, the Crusaders breached the walls. The city fell, and a wave of triumph surged through the weary army. But victory came at a terrible cost. Their numbers were thinned, and the true test still lay ahead. Because beyond Antioch, in the summer heat of 1099, rose the city they had dreamed of for years, Jerusalem. When the Crusaders arrived, they were gaunt, sunburned, and battle-worn. Yet the sight of the holy city filled them with unshakable resolve. The walls loomed high, guarded fiercely by Muslim defenders. For weeks, the Crusaders circled, building siege towers, preparing for one final push. Then, on July 15, 1099, the attack began. Siege towers rolled forward under a hail of arrows. Ladders clattered against stone walls. Shouts and screams filled the air. Blood flowed in the streets as steel clashed against steel. A Crusader knight, his surcoat stained with dust and blood, cried out as he raised his sword, "For Christ! For Jerusalem!" And then it happened. The Crusaders broke through, the gates were opened, and the city fell. Jerusalem was theirs. The joy was overwhelming, but it was without horror. The aftermath was brutal. Blood ran through the streets as Crusaders exacted vengeance and claimed their prize. The holy city was captured, but the world would remember the carnage that followed. Still, to the Crusaders, this was divine triumph. Pilgrims fell to their knees at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, tears streaming down their faces. After years of sacrifice, the impossible had been achieved. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond belief, but this was not the end. It was the beginning of centuries of holy war, shifting alliances, and legendary battles that would shape the destiny of Europe and the Middle East.
What happens when faith collides with ambition and kings march to war not just for God, but for glory? The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 was hailed as a miracle. Yet in truth, it was only the beginning of a storm that would rage for 2 centuries. For the holy city was not destined to remain in Christian hands forever. By the mid-12th century, Muslim unity began to rise under powerful leaders. The most legendary of them all was Saladin Yusa ibn Ayyub, Saladin. Saladin was no ordinary commander. He was a warrior, a scholar, and a man of faith. While Christian Europe praised knights draped in steel, Saladin inspired his men with humility and justice. His reputation spread far and wide, not only feared as a general, but respected as a man of honor. In 1187, the inevitable clash came. The Christian armies marched from Jerusalem and met Saladin at the Battle of Hattin. The desert sun scorched the earth, and the Crusaders, parched and exhausted, found themselves surrounded. Flames and smoke rose as Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass, choking the Crusaders with heat and dust. Knights fell, their banners crushed in the sand. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured, the true cross seized. Jerusalem, the jewel of the Crusades, was once again in Muslim hands. The shock reverberated through Europe. The cry went up, another crusade must be launched. And this time, it was not just knights and peasants who answered, it was kings. Thus came the Third Crusade, led by 3 of the most famous monarchs in history: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The journey was perilous. Barbarossa drowned before reaching the Holy Land. Philip turned back, leaving only Richard. Yet Richard the English king carried the weight of Christendom on his shoulders. Richard and Saladin, two titans of history, clashed in a series of battles that shook the world. At Acre, at Arsef, their forces collided in fire and steel. Richard's bravery was unmatched, his sword flashing like lightning in battle. Saladin, calm and strategic, countered with wave after wave of disciplined fighters. Though Richard never recaptured Jerusalem, he carved his name into legend. His campaigns forced Saladin into truce, granting Christian pilgrims safe passage to the Holy City. And though enemies, Richard and Saladin grew to respect each other, their names forever linked as symbols of chivalry and faith. The Crusades would not end here. More expeditions followed. The Fourth Crusade, which shockingly turned its fury on Christian Constantinople instead of the Holy Land, plundering one of the greatest cities of Christendom. The Children's Crusade, a tragic tale of faith and manipulation, where thousands of children marched, never to return. The dream of permanently holding Jerusalem faded with each passing century, but the Crusades had changed Europe and the Middle East forever. They had birthed legends, scarred generations, and woven a tapestry of war, faith, betrayal, and resilience. The Lionheart and Saladin may be gone, but their shadows stretch across the centuries, reminding us that in the clash of civilizations, glory and tragedy often march side by side. What happens when a great fire burns for too long? Does it consume its enemies, or does it consume itself? By the 13th century, the once mighty Crusades were losing their fire. The dream of a united Christendom fighting for the Holy Land had fractured into greed, politics, and betrayal. The Fourth Crusade marked the turning point. Instead of Jerusalem, the Crusaders turned their swords on Constantinople, a Christian city, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. In 1204, its churches were looted, its palaces burned, its holy relics stolen. A crusade born to defend faith had instead devoured its own. Meanwhile, Muslim forces grew stronger, more organized. The Ayyubid dynasty gave way to the Mamluks, fierce warrior slaves who rose to power in Egypt. In 1291, they stormed the last Crusader stronghold at Acre. The Red Cross banner of the Crusaders was torn down. Christendom's foothold in the Holy Land was lost forever. But the Crusades were not forgotten. They reshaped the world in ways far beyond the battlefield. They opened channels of trade between East and West. Spices, silk, medicine, and knowledge flowed into Europe, fueling the Renaissance. They sparked cultural encounters that would echo for centuries. Ideas of chivalry, architecture, and even science were exchanged amidst the bloodshed. They also deepened divisions between Christians and Muslims, between Latin West and Byzantine East, and even within Europe itself. Kings gained power, while the papacy's influence rose and fell. The Crusades became both a memory of devotion and a warning of destruction. Yet, in the midst of violence, stories of humanity endured. The unlikely respect between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the courage of ordinary pilgrims who marched across continents, the tragic idealism of the Children's Crusade. The Crusades ended in failure of their ultimate goal. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but their legacy was far more complex. They left scars, they left lessons, and they left legends that still stir the imagination today. When we look back on the Crusades, we see not just a clash of swords, but a mirror of humanity itself, its faith, its folly, its hunger for glory, and its endless struggle between destruction and hope.